Well, I'm recovering from a cold, which is why I sound like an unholy alliance between Barry White and Steve Urkel. But this is Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr, and joining me today is my friend Alex Bernardo from the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Alex, good to see you again, my friend.
It's good to see you too, Kevin, and you look and sound fantastic. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
I really need to try to lean into this a little bit. I sound like some sort of mysterious character. And if I had some
Yeah,
really cool lines, or like a cigar or something, that would really that would
no,
really lean into it.
it is awesome. Like it is actually really sweet the way that your voice sounds.
I need to try and record some like YouTube shorts or something while I've got this going
I do
before
feel like you
everything.
need kind of like a nice what do they call it? I don't have like a robe, maybe a pipe. I feel like that's kind of the atmosphere that your voice evokes.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. Now my university has issues with with substance use and things like that. And I personally don't have any
Oh yes.
vices. But yeah, that would go with it. Like the pipe and the like the jacket. It'll be like a velvet jacket by a fireplace or something. I've got a high back leather chair behind me, but I'm halfway
Right.
there.
Which is nice. Yeah, I know. And it's a good color too, that nice maroon color. Yeah,
Yeah,
you got all of the pieces are there.
I just need to put them together. Well, Alex, it's good to catch back up with you again. For those of you who are new to the podcast, or for those who I might have forgotten, Alex and I first ran into each other, maybe a couple of years on Twitter. Yeah, my apologies for dead naming it. Now X these days. We ran into each other because I was tweeting about the Asbury revival, and you were also interested in understanding kind of what was going on. And so I think I was on you had me and another guest on, and then eventually I had you on to talk about Christian libertarianism. So good to have you back, my friend.
Yeah. Hey, it is good to be back. And I think you actually came back on my show a second time to do a solo episode on like Christian political engagement or something like that.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
that
that's
was a
right.
fun one.
I enjoyed that. And it's stuff that I like talking about. But I personally have to be very careful with how I talk about it because I have been unwise too many times, usually on Facebook, with how I've engaged with other people about how Christians ought to live their lives and how we ought to be political. And so I figured, like, well, if I just do my own podcast, then I can just say whatever I want, right?
Right.
Yeah, if only. Yeah, if only.
Yeah,
Al,
unfortunately, people actually listen to the stuff that you put out on your podcast. I mean, I got in a little bit of trouble just as a side note on mine because I'm a public school teacher and I've done a couple of episodes on public education and it's like a vanity project thing for
yeah,
me because I'm interested in it personally. And I interviewed a guy who was like a high school math teacher or an English teacher or something like that for 20 years, and he was just talking about his experience and then why he left. And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that there's a heavy amount of indoctrination that occurs in public schools, and we had a conversation about that. And it's funny because we did that in like April of last year, but then at the very beginning of this school year, back in I guess August, I got drugged into my principal's office because someone made an anonymous complaint about how I was saying that the public schools were indoctrinating kids, and they had like a screenshot of my tweet about that episode and everything. But I was like, well, I really believe this, and I have my First Amendment rights, so what are we going to do about it? And the answer is nothing. So but people do listen, and
they
oh,
do.
I'm sure that person didn't listen. I'm sure they just saw me on Twitter. But whatever, you,
Yeah,
you get that. I understand the position you're in.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, have they even seen the kinds of things you say about the Department of Education?
Oh, that's a whole nother conversation.
Alex, one of the things that I wanted to mention to you, or I wanted to talk with you about today, was you had this provocative tweet or a series of posts on X, really kind of periodically, where you note what I think are obvious comparisons with Christian nationalism, which if anybody's been paying attention to sort of how um like what is coming out of the academy today, sort of the issue du jour one of the issues du jour is Christian nationalism and how it's this, great evil, and how Republicans are Christian nationalists and they're going to turn things into The Handmaid's Tale,
Right.
and which I've never seen an episode of. But it's
Yeah.
like it's in the cultural zeitgeist, and so I kind of know what.
The red hat.
Yeah,
Not the
I like
MAGA ones though. The woman with the bonnet, I think, is what they
yeah,
call
the
those.
red bonnet.
Right.
Yeah, the red bonnet. Yeah, but like you've noticed, so what I think correctly are some real connections with that and with progressive Christianity's approach to what kinds of policies and things that they want to see implemented. And I'll give the caveat there because the term progressive, especially when it's tacked on to Christianity, that can conjure up a variety of images for people. What I mean is not getting into issues of worship styles or
Yeah.
women's participation in the public assembly. Like that's not what I'm talking about. What I mean there is sort of a politically, bent towards a more progressive or quote unquote liberal kind of political agenda. That sort of Christianity. You've seen a progressive Christian nationalism and Christian nationalism appear to be pretty similar. Talk to me about that, because I think you're right, but run with that and tell me like what is up with that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something that I'm really passionate about on my show. All of these terms are very subjective and we have to define them. And there are a lot of different ways of conceptualizing nationalism. And it's, I guess, inception in the 19th century. The way that people use that term back then is slightly different than I guess, the resonances that that word evokes today. But essentially, a couple of years ago, when I joined the Libertarian Christian Institute, this would have been in early 2023. I was doing a lot of work on Christian nationalism because they had decided that as an organization, that was going to be their focus for the year. And I had not really been that interested in it previously because I just kind of saw it as basically the kind of like moral majority right wing Christian cultural sphere that I had grown up with in the church. And I was like, well, I know that that doesn't really work. So I didn't dedicate a lot of time to it. But then I was tasked with reviewing Stephen Wolf's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. And I got to say that even within Christian nationalism, there is a wide variety of perspectives about how that would work out in practice. I think that Stephen Wolf, I've kind of built a relationship with him. I have a very positive relationship with him. I think that he's way smarter than most of the other Christian nationalists. And in terms of actual policy, he's like an old school paleo conservative. And so a lot of his positions aren't that dissimilar from my own. So he's a very intelligent guy. But as I was going through his book, I realized that like his definition of Christian nationalism stems from his fundamental definition of nationalism. And when he describes nationalism, he describes it as essentially a group of people that conceptualize themselves as a nation acting on behalf of that nation. And Christian nationalism just incorporates Christianity into that, that it's a self-consciously Christian people that are enacting laws and customs based on their Christian values that shape the course of a nation. And when I read his definition of Christian nationalism, I was like, well, progressive Christians do the exact same thing. And I've had a lot of engagement with progressive Christians on Twitter over the last couple of years, and I've read some of their literature, and I've always known just kind of personally some people that have like deconstructed and gone in that direction. And it was just very apparent to me that they really do operate with the same set of assumptions about the nature of state power as the right-wing Christian nationalist. Structurally, I would say that progressive Christian nationalism, which is what I'm calling left-wing Christian nationalism, and conservative Christian nationalism are fundamentally the same. They all believe that the laws and customs of the nation, not of like individual states or counties or cities or anything like that, but that the laws and customs of a nation ought to reflect their interpretation of particular Christian values. Now, obviously, the left wingers interpret that in light of their progressive political ideology, and the right wingers interpret that in light of their conservative political ideology. But the underlying foundation is the same. Both of them want to use the power of the state to impose their Christian values on the rest of society. And Stephen Wolf argues this, and as do the progressives, they do this for the good of society. Now, Stephen has he goes back to like Aristotle again. He's a very smart and intelligent guy, and in reality, he's a lot more intelligent than a lot of his progressive critics critics want to give him credit for. So he has this kind of big philosophical foundation for the reason he believes this, but it ultimately winds up with the same conclusion that we have this conception of the good of society that is based upon our subjective interpretations of the Bible, and these different variations of Christian nationalism on the left and on the right seek to impose those subjective interpretations of biblical values on society for their own good. And so there really isn't any difference except for like the raw policy
Mm.
between progressive Christians wanting to seize political power and the conservative Christians on the Christian nationalist right wanting to grab hold of power. The only difference is really in policy. Now, obviously, those policies are dramatically different, and in a lot of ways, as a libertarian, I think I'd rather live in like a right wing Christian nationalist society than a left wing Christian nationalist society. But they want essentially the same thing, and I ultimately reject the notion that Christians should want to use state power to try to force people through law to comply with our values. But they both agree that that should be the goal.
Yeah, and for me, that's what I've started to see also is that, the idea is always, well, you can't force, like one side says, particularly what I've seen in the past is, more left-leaning or politically progressive Christians saying you can't you can't force other people. You can't legislate morality. You can't force other people to do, to have these sort of Christian values. That's why it's a waste of time for you to, for you to try to get Roe v. Wade repealed and things like that. Um, you know, I would, say first off that, like, I think it's pretty clear that, morality forms the basis for, for just laws, right?
Hmm.
Like rape, theft, and murder have always been moral issues.
Yes.
And, that's, and therefore there are good reasons to legislate against those things. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, you can actually legislate morality. Um, but for those who are kind of new to this issue of libertarianism, Alex, let's get back to the use of state force, but talk to us a little bit about this political spectrum. You've mentioned something that you've written online for the Libertarian Christian Institute, which I will link to below, where you argue that you, the real political spectrum, or maybe the most meaningful political spectrum, is not right versus left, but it's authoritarian versus libertarian. Could you
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit about that first? Because that makes sense to me, but it kind of spell it out for us a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this goes back to kind of the same paradox that I saw with Christian nationalism and the progressive response to that. The 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 conservatives and progressives in the United States today, regardless of whether they're Christian or not, they do have dramatically different conceptions of which sorts of policies ought to be enacted. And it is true that progressives in general want kind of a larger role for the government intervening in economic affairs, and conservatives tend to want a more limited role for that. But the reality is that they both believe that there is a role for the state to play in all of the private affairs of these citizens. And so the problem with this from a libertarian perspective is that the fundamental presupposition of libertarian philosophy is the non-aggression principle. And this is the idea that an individual does not have the right to initiate aggression against another peaceful individual. And a lot of this is based on kind of a Lockean conception of natural rights. John Locke is the father of classical liberalism, which is kind of the movement that spawned libertarianism. And his essential point was that if a government was going to exist, the government's only role should be to protect people's natural rights, the rights that are given to them by God, life, liberty, property. And libertarianism just takes that idea to its logical conclusion, to its extreme. So libertarians believe that under no circumstances does anyone have the right to initiate aggression against another person. And this is something that the libertarian theorist Murray Rothbard talks a lot about in his work, that we have to apply this as a moral principle to every area of life. There's not like a special carve out for somebody just because they happen to win an election. If you're democratically elected, it doesn't give you the right to initiate aggression against peaceful people. The problem and the big difference between conservatives and progressives on one side and libertarians on the other is that conservatives and progressives assume that at least in certain situations, it is okay to initiate force against peaceful people. It's okay to tax. It's okay to throw people in prison for behavior that we deem to be morally, reprehensible. It's okay to violate somebody's natural rights if it's for the greater good of society. And libertarians reject that altogether. It's never right. And just because you happen to be a part of the political class, that doesn't give you a right to take what doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't give you a right to harm somebody, and it doesn't give you a right to throw somebody in jail because you're not supportive of their work. And so again, like we kind of like in our American culture, and I think there are some historical reasons for this, our political conflicts are framed by this kind of left, right, progressive, conservative spectrum. But in reality, the left and right have a lot more in common with each other than they do with us libertarians. Like they have the same set of fundamental working assumptions, and that they all believe that in certain instances it is okay for a group of people or individuals to aggress against those who are peaceful. And for libertarians, we believe that that's always immoral. And so I think that if we're going to conceptualize like objectively, if we're going to come up with kind of a concrete and universally applicable way of interpreting political behavior, then the real spectrum has to be between libertarianism and authoritarianism. And that those are really the only two philosophically consistent options we have. The left and the right are both authoritarian to greater or lesser degrees, but they all share authoritarian presuppositions nonetheless.
Yeah. So it would be fair to say if you're looking on kind of on a political spectrum of political options that you have trending more towards the authoritarian side, you have progressives and conservatives, relatively not very far away from each other.
Yeah.
And then, on trending towards the libertarian side, you have libertarians of all stripes, right? And it's funny to see libertarians, beat each other up on X because it's especially in the most recent election, um, because the idea there is, I you know I feel like comfortable. I can say this because I've got friends who are Calvinist. If you're 1 point less Calvinist than I
Yeah.
am, then you're not a real Calvinist.
Yes. Yes.
And so, like, if you're 1 point less libertarian than I am, you're not a real libertarian, you
Right.
know. But I
It's
can,
true.
yeah, that's what I've seen. And so, but the idea is that, you know, our scope is too narrow if we see this huge difference between progressives and conservatives. You would say that we should zoom out some and see that no, actually progressives and conservatives, particularly Christians who are either progressive Christian or conservative Christian in terms of political engagement, they are actually not very far away from each other. And that is because they both choose to use the means of state force, persuasion, coercion, policy, etc., to implement the things that they want to see. Is that a fair representation of kind of what you've been saying?
Yes, and again, for because I know your audience is probably primarily conservative, and I want to say this to make sure that they understand exactly what I'm saying. It's not that progressives, the conclusions of conservative policy positions and the conclusions of progressive policy positions are dramatically different. And if we had if we were living in a country that was determined completely by conservative political principles, it would look dramatically different, and in my opinion, probably a lot better than a country that was being run based primarily on progressive
Yeah.
principles. However, the underlying assumptions about the nature and necessity of violent and coercive power for maintaining a peaceful society are the same. So even though they're coming to different conclusions, they're beginning at the same starting point, whereas libertarians believe that there's a fundamentally different starting point, that we don't have to begin with the inevitability of state violence.
So again, to use another metaphor, and I'm just rolling with the metaphors today, but
I love
I'm
it.
I'm I'm a teacher now, so
Yes.
that's what I've got to do. To use another metaphor, imagine a tree, right? The trunk is authority in the sense of, like, the state's power, and then two branches going off in opposite directions. That would one would be the conservative policies of, really kind of a historically conservative policy would be, at least the trimming back of abortion access, if not total abolition thereof.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas a typically progressive policy would be something like, a mandated minimum wage, whether it's 15 or something else like that, or government funded, taxpayer funded healthcare or things like that, where the policies, root out, but they are nourished by that same single trunk of it is the state which does these kinds of things. Abortion might not be the best option there because I'd argue that that falls in line perfectly with the non-aggression principle that, like, this is innocent human life
Yeah, yeah,
and is
and I
therefore
totally agree with that. Yeah.
and is therefore wrong, right? But take some other maybe more appropriate example then. Um, you'd say libertarians are on a different tree, right?
Yeah.
Like we're doing something else. So what in addition to like a minimum wage or some other like universal health care or something like that, you actually had some pretty good examples from an article that you wrote a couple of years ago on progressive Christianity. Do you remember some of those examples from some, like, I think you quoted some guy from the New Evangelicals and you quoted some other pastor from Austin. Do you remember some of those?
Well, yeah, I mean, and a lot of them are just kind of the standard progressive economic policy platform positions that are kind of universally assumed by people on the left. Again, it's things like a minimum wage, it's things like universal health care, student loan forgiveness. All of these things are done in the name of the progressive Christian interpretation of biblical justice, but they have to be imposed upon the rest of society by the federal government. And again, the progressive Christians never want to do this like at the state and local level. They all want it to be done at the national level. And a really good example of this, actually, from right before I got on the show today, was that I happened to be scrolling through Twitter. And yeah, I'm sure, are you familiar with the podcast, The Holy Post? It's Phil Vischer and Caitlin Scheiss and
I've heard of it.
those.
Yeah,
Okay, the
yeah. And
VeggieTales guy,
Phil
which,
Vischer is the VeggieTales guy.
yes.
Yeah,
And I love VeggieTales, but they are I don't want to, I don't know really how to put this without sounding condescending. So I guess I'm just going to say it. They try to be kind of like we're in the center, but we're asking all these deep questions and we're moving beyond conservative evangelicalism and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, they're just, I mean, a lot of them are just kind of left wingers. And so Phil Vischer posted something about how, Doge was cutting back on US aid, right? That all of these
yeah.
programs that were sending American taxpayer dollars to all of these extremely nebulous campaigns, both domestic and abroad, and all of that stuff. And essentially, the way that the tweet was phrased is that, all these Christians out there say that they want to help people that are in need. They say they want to provide aid and they want to provide charity. Why is it that they're opposed to legislation that would help people that are in need? That is a classic example of progressive Christian nationalism, because the fundamental presupposition is that the only way that we can effectively distribute charity is by doing it through these government programs. But like, what these people always fail to realize is that the only way that the government can fund these programs is by taking money from other people. The government doesn't produce anything. The government only takes. Like, that's what taxation is. It's a non-productive entity taking a part of the productivity of another productive group of people. And so, like, you can say that the government should redistribute resources, or you can say that the government should have a monopoly or a big hand in charity, but you have to understand, like, these policies do hurt real people. Like, there are a lot of people that are on the edge of the poverty line that have to pay their 40% in taxes every year to the government, and these policies that are designed to help another group of people ultimately wind up hurting one group of people. And they just completely fail to realize the basic economic logic of that. And the idea behind it all is that, like, okay, well, we're Christians. Our value is charity. And if there's a government program that says that it's about aid and helping people, then we should support that, because that's what good Christians should do, without ever kind of like thinking, well, you are really just trying to use state power to do the thing that, like, we as individual Christians are called by God and the Bible to do. And that's exactly what Christian nationalists believe as well. Now, they wouldn't believe that with like USAID or with these kind of charities. They would
Right.
do it with, like, like banning marijuana or something like that. Of course, it's for the good of society that no one smokes pot because we know that that always leads to bad consequences would be their logic. But Phil Vischer and, people on the left are making the exact same claims, only with these kind of taboo, token, left wing political issues. And so you can see that, like, that's just a perfect example of progressive Christian nationalism. They want the nation to reflect their subjective Christian values, and they're willing to use the force of law to impose it on other people without thinking about the externalities or the consequences of what these policies do to people that are forced to pay for them.
Yeah. One thing that I'm increasingly convinced of is that for, the self-professed, um, I just lost the word. Yeah, the self-professed Christian pacifist who is also politically progressive. And again, these terms are kind of fishy. I like to think of progressive in the sense that yes, the belief is that culture is sort of progressing, and we can do that through incremental increases and use of policy and state power and things like that. Um, I also think it's fair to say it's like what progressive or liberal has come to mean is a progressive in the sense of increasing or liberal in the sense of extensive use of state power to implement the kinds of policies that one sees important. One thing that I distinctly remember growing up is, you know, that it was left wingers, it was Democrats who were pacifists.
Yeah.
And like take a guy like Shane Claiborne.
Hmm.
There's a name that was wildly popular when I was in high school from 2000 2004 and then early college. So for like I was hearing his name show up a lot. Let's say 2004 to 12 or something like that. Like that time span there. Noted pacifist. Noted pacifist. I remember him and others like him and students that I went to school with who were also, self-professed pacifists. They were against the Iraq War.
Yeah.
They were against, continuing to send the U.S. to the Middle East and for Afghanistan and all these places. Um, and so on the one hand, they were claiming to be pacifists, but on the other hand, they were saying things like, we need to use the government's power to implement these kinds of policies and take this money in taxes for, these poor communities and for these other things like that. It's like, I never, something never really sat right with me about that until years later when I started to actually have the language of saying, it's like, oh, you're claiming to be pacifist, but the means by which you want to help all these other people is through threats of force and violence by state action. It's like maybe you're not sufficiently pacifist,
Yeah.
which and like that's not a death
Yeah.
death blow to anybody because like I'm not sufficiently righteous. Okay,
Right.
I'm
Right.
perfectly aware of that. But like maybe you're not as pacifist as you think you are if your first or primary means by helping, means by fulfilling your mandate to love others is, stops in the lobby of US Aid and says, "All right, you guys take it from here."
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's philosophically inconsistent. And this is one of the points that I was trying to make in that article that I published about progressive Christian nationalism is that there's this kind of visceral emotional reaction to the idea that there will be these right-wing Christians that want to remake America as an explicitly Christian nation, but then they're doing the exact same thing on the left. And in reality, they're not mad because these conservatives are trying to use state power to achieve their ends. They're upset because they rightly see these conservatives as a threat to their own appropriation of state power. That's the real reason why they're fundamentally upset. And to your point, like I
That's
got
a
a
hot
good
take,
buddy.
by the way.
But
That's a
yeah,
hot take.
but I mean, like I don't see, like, if you step back and try to look at it objectively, I don't really see any other way to read that scenario than that's what it is. It's like they, again, really the only, and this is one of the things I tried to cultivate a lot of positive relationships on Twitter with some of these progressive Christians leading up to the election, and a lot of them just like they just completely sold out all of their principles when they wholeheartedly supported and endorsed Kamala Harris. And I just remember making the point like, man, you guys say that you believe in peace and justice, and her administration is currently funding a what I consider to be a genocide against the people of Palestine. Like, how in the world can you say that you're voting for justice and not even mention that? And it's like they have no answer to that question because they don't care about it, because what they really fundamentally care about, unfortunately, is grabbing the reins of power to remake the world in their own subjective image. I got a buddy of mine at the Libertarian Christian Institute, Cody Cook. He's like a radical Anabaptist, and he actually, I'm sure it'll be out by the time that this interview is released. I just interviewed him 2 days ago. He's got a brand new book called The Anarchist Anabaptist, and he talks about that dynamic within Anabaptist movements, where he's like, okay, these we Anabaptists claim that we're pacifist, but like all of these big Anabaptist thought leaders are like these radical progressives, and he makes the exact same point that you made. It's like it's philosophically inconsistent to say that you believe in non-aggression, but then want the state to confiscate property and then put a gun to the head of people that don't want to give up their property and throw them in prison if they refuse to give it up, and say that you're a passive. You can't be both. And I think that this is why we have to have like a more rational understanding of what exactly is going on. And I guess like and the thing I respect about the conservative Christian nationalists is that they openly admit that they want to use power to achieve their desired ends. And I appreciate that because they're
Yeah.
being honest about what they're doing. Whereas on
Wolf
the
is
left, they
pretty
kind of,
open about that in his, sorry to cut you off, but Wolf
yeah,
is pretty open in his book about
yeah,
that, right? Like
yes,
I, I've read your review, I've read another review, and then maybe a couple of years ago when that book was really starting to make some headway with folks, I interviewed a guy named Wes McAdams, who's a prominent minister in our circles. You know, he was making the same argument that these guys are, like, to your point, these what we'd call conservative Christian nationalists are open about the fact that they think that the way to implement what vision they see is rooted in the state's power, the state's coercive power.
yeah. Yeah, and no, and that is the conservative critique of libertarianism. And philosophically, it's consistent. Conservatives are like, oh, these libertarian principles are great, except you can't ever get anything done. And there are sometimes you just have to take up that power and you have to get the job done, which is essentially what the Christian nationalists are arguing about. And what's so frustrating about the rhetoric of the progressive Christians, and again, go and follow any major progressive Christian account on Twitter, and you'll see a million tweets about we're enacting God's love and mercy and justice, and we believe in a better world, and we believe that we have to help the poor, and how come these evil conservatives are trying to stop us? But never is there an acknowledgement that the only way that they think that that can come about is by using the power of the state to coerce and control other people to fall in line with their political agenda. And it's the same thing. Like, it's like they don't even think about the consequences of this. It's just like, it's a point I brought up with a couple people, and they never have an answer to it before. But we're forced to pay like 40% of our annual income in income taxes, or
Man, I'm
30, or
doing my
whatever tax
taxes
bracket you're in.
now. I'm doing my
Right?
taxes
Yeah.
now,
We're,
and man, it hurts. Oh gosh,
it
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 hurts.
sucks. But
Ugh.
imagine if I like, okay, so one of the things that, and it might not be true of the progressive left in America in 2025, because it does seem like they've completely sold out to the war machine. Like they're right in the pocket of the military industrial complex as a response to Trump. It's very sad. But like theoretically, people on the left should be against war. But like for me, if I say, well, you know what, I'll pay half of my income taxes, the ones that go to entitlement programs, but I'm not going to let the government take the money from me that I know that they're going to use to give to weapons manufacturers to wage all of these wars for profit and choice overseas, because I philosophically don't agree with that. Well, what does the government do? They put a gun to my head and they tell me if I don't do it, they're going to take my house, separate me from a family, and throw me in prison. And the progressives are fine with doing that on the other side. Like if someone doesn't want to give up their money that they've rightfully earned to fund these entitlement programs that don't actually work or help anybody, then the left is fine with the state coming in and saying you have to do it behind the threat of violence. And I just think it's completely philosophically inconsistent. And I appreciate the fact that right wingers at least admit that that's what they're doing. I just wish that progressive Christians on the left would just accept that, yes, we do want to use violence to see our preferred social ends reached.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here because I'm tracing what I think might be some potential critiques of kind of what you and I are talking about here. Take a biblical example, Joseph or Daniel and his compatriots Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Um, we see these guys in pretty prominent positions of state power
Hmm.
in in empires that were routinely condemned in the Bible
Yeah.
for their violence and oppression, like the actual violence, millennia of for Egypt's case at least, millennia you know practice of slavery for millennia, things like that.
Yeah.
Um, we see them. And for some, I think they might, for some perhaps progressive Christians today, politically progressive Christians today, they might look at Joseph and Daniel and think, well, look, aren't are these not models for how good can be done through, Joseph's program of gathering grain, or for Daniel's work in all the various things that he would have done in Babylon. And I would look at that and think there is a principle within the Bible where we see God meeting people kind of culturally where they are, and he takes them there and then pulls them, calls them, invites them, sometimes drags them in the case of Saul's conversion there in Acts 9. But he pulls them along to a place that is along a trajectory that is increasingly Christ-like. So if we look at something like slavery, for example, in the Bible, I would argue the wrong perspective to take from the Bible's discussion of slavery, particularly the New Testament, because what Paul says about slaves and master relationships in Ephesians and Colossians, and then Peter mentions it again in First Peter as well. The wrong perspective to take there is, well, you see, the Bible doesn't immediately condemn this.
Right.
Therefore, I, as a early 19th century, cotton farmer in Georgia, can therefore hold these many slaves and enslave these many persons and things like that because the Bible doesn't condemn it, or Paul even says that I ought to do treat these individuals this way. um I would argue that no, that's not what Paul means. That's not what God was intended to show Paul. God was working with Paul and those congregations, with sort of where they were, and then was showing Paul how, even within a cultural context, that institution can be, quite frankly, pretty radically transformed to the degree that Paul can tell Philemon, the slave holding elder of the church that meets in his house, like you can tell Philemon to welcome Onesimus back just as a slave, right?
Yeah.
Welcome him back as a brother. I think there's a there's a nugget there that we're supposed to see, that there's a trajectory that gets us to a point where we look back and say, there's something grand and beautiful here that you know that really comes to fruition in some of the 19th century abolitionist movement,
Yeah.
where we look at particularly the Atlantic slave trade, which was by no means the only historic slave trade in the world.
Yeah. To put it mildly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's just the most recent one that has gotten
Yeah.
some kind of publicity, but where we can legitimately look at that and say this is damnable. We outrightly, we justly condemn this kind of thing. um, we can see that, you know, from a Christian perspective, there's a trajectory that's being drawn here. I mean, even one of the things that God critiques the Roman Empire about in the book of Revelation is the buying and selling of human souls. And so I if that's an appropriate way to kind of look at how God is leading his people on through this, like taking them where they are and then and leading them, to a greater place through the long, slow march sometimes of history because God is gracious and like it takes us a while to get some things.
Right.
Then I wonder if we could say, what Joseph and Daniel were doing using using state power, using their positions in authority. God was taking them for where they were, and showing them how even in those kinds of situations you can still be God honoring. But I wouldn't want to therefore use that as a model, to say Christians ought to therefore clamor for political power so we can then institute all the things that we think God is leading us to do. Because I don't get that message from Joseph and Daniel. I did not plan on mentioning that, and
Yeah.
I'm dropping a lot at you,
No,
but
I think it's good.
does
Yeah.
that even seem reasonable? Like what do you even think about that?
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think that there are a lot of kind of basic hermeneutical considerations that we have to take into effect here. And that's just the idea that, like, ultimately, the intention of any given text or the meaning of any given text is completely determined by the intention of the author. And I think that on the face of it, we have to understand that the authors of the Bible are, by definition, not trying to give answers to modern social, political, and economic questions because the context in antiquity is a lot different than the context today. And so this is one of the things that I see like a lot of progressive Christians doing is that they'll take a passage in the New Testament. I don't know, like Acts chapter 2 is a great example of this, where the church in Jerusalem is they're selling all of their
Yeah.
possessions and they're sharing with everyone so that no one in that church has any needs. Okay, which is an Acts, and that's what they did there, and that's a good thing. And I think that there's a principle that we can derive from that, and that's the principle
Yeah.
of radical charity. We can't therefore deduce from that passage that we have to have a centralized welfare state that is controlled by some of the most corrupt
Oh
politicians
my
on the face
gosh.
of the planet.
Yeah.
But they just gloss over that. They think, okay, well, if the Bible says charity here, then that means that that has to be an exact approximation of the way that my government has told me charity has to be run in the modern world. I mean, not only is that just kind of an anachronistic and false historical equivalency, but that was not the intention of Luke when he wrote Acts. Like he wasn't trying to say that. And again, you look at the rest of the churches throughout Paul's missionary journeys. Were there any other churches that were as radical in terms of selling their possessions as the church in Jerusalem? No, they were not. And then ultimately, when there was a famine, which church wound up needing the most help? It was the one in Jerusalem. So it might not even work that well, you know? And so, and that's something that people don't
Don't
consider.
take that too far.
Yeah, yeah, and again, that's a side note here. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever. But then yes, and I think ultimately the one of the things that's so appealing about the Bible is that the writers of the Bible deal with the world as it actually is, in light of the way that it is going to be when God finally consummates the kingdom. And the Book of Revelation is an excellent example of that. Like in the end, Revelation 21 and 22, the evil empires of the world, the great fall of Babylon, which just represents all earthly power in Revelation 18, will fall, and the new heavens and the new earth will come, and that will be the end of all arbitrary human power. So that's the vision in the future. But in reality, we have to deal with the fact that those institutions still exist. And so it's like you were saying, I think the Bible gives us a lot of principles that I think are pretty clear about how we as Christians can navigate these really complex social, political, and economic realities. We just have to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's faithful to the intention of the original, of the original author, and that we're not reading our own historical context back into the scripture. And again, like one more good example of this, the Acts one, obviously a little hyperbolic, and I was trying to make a joke there, but like with Jeremiah, you have the
Yeah.
very famous passage in Jeremiah 29:7 where Jeremiah tells the exiles to seek the welfare of the city when they're in Babylon, and then later on in that exact same chapter, Jeremiah says, well, one day God's going to come back and absolutely wipe Babylon off the face of the planet. So one might think that there's a little bit of a contradiction there. All right, well, what is it, God? Is it that we should try to support this civilization and we should try to make it flourish and be better? or is it that we should be praying for you to bring about the dramatic end of it, and if we can escape it, we should? Well, the answer is that both is it's both. Like we have to live with the reality of the, what Paul calls the principalities and powers as they exist now, but we have to try to navigate that in light of the way that it ought to be. And it's just that theme in the New Testament of inaugurated eschatology, that we do believe that the kingdom is a present reality because Jesus has been raised from the dead as the first fruits, and he ascended and is currently sitting at the right hand of the Father, which is that really powerful image that we get in Revelation 4 and 5. But we still have to deal with the reality of human governance. And as Christians, we have an obligation to represent our King, but then also do so in a way that's not harmful to other people. And it's very complicated. But I think that there are too many Christians on the left and the right that just, without even thinking about the complexities of these issues, just read their own contemporary political biases back into the text, as if the text is designed to give us answers to these very specific modern questions. And I just don't think that the Bible can or should do that. I don't think that that's not the reason why God gave that to the church.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm increasingly skeptical that any verse, any single verse taken out of context is going to give us an easy answer to to a policy matter in 21st century United States of America. Now, the general witness of Scripture, or to use a term, sort of the general tenor of Scripture and the historic witness of the church, that that gives us some good direction that we can see how God has been, what God has said to his people throughout history as it's represented in the Bible, and how his people have understood those kinds of things. That gives us, some really good indication. But to your point, taking Acts 2, and there's a similar summary statement at the end of Acts chapter 4,
Mhm.
taking both of those and saying, see, the early church was, free market capitalist, or the early church was socialist. It's like, th- let's dial that back. Let's dial that back because that's not even Luke's main point there, but particularly with, claims that, because they were helping each other, we should therefore use state power and, state coercion to help each other. You know, that that's technically a non sequitur that just
Yeah.
does not follow from the premise. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I mean, Christians are called to radical charity. That is a theme that is ubiquitous throughout Scripture from start to finish. But you cannot find one example, not one, in the New Testament of the earliest Christians advocating that either the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem or the local political authorities or the Roman imperial order made sure that that charity was dispensed to the rest of society by force. There's not a single passage that justifies that mentality. And in reality, the responsibility is laid at the feet of the church. Or if we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, which is kind of like this is what Joshua Jipp calls the fundamental presupposition of New Testament theology, the idea that Jesus is the Christ, that he's currently the king reigning over all creation, and that if we as Gentiles through our faith have been incorporated into the family of Abraham, we are the true family, the one as Paul's big argument in Romans 3 and 4 and in Galatians 3 and 4 and in Ephesians, the entire book. This is so fundamental to the way that we have to conceptualize ourselves. Like we are members of the kingdom of God, which means that we have access to the true king and the true kingdom. So it's our responsibility to provide for the needs of those that can't take care of themselves. And this is the dynamic that people miss out a lot. And it's that sense of like personal and then communal responsibility. If we are children of the Messiah and if we're called to be obedient to him, then we have obligations towards other people. And we can't expect that some third party is going to come in and do that work for us. In fact, we're abdicating our responsibility as Christians if we want to hand those powers over to the state. And I know that there are a lot of people out there, and this is kind of when I've talked to some progressive Christians about this before, and their response is, well, what if this, what if Christianity like can't cover, like what if Christians can't cover all the gaps? And I'm like, well, it's our responsibility to try as hard as we can. That doesn't mean that we need to have a third party come in and take money from another group of people and give it to people that we think are more deserving. That's just that principle, that notion is nowhere found in the New Testament.
Yeah, there's this idea that if we can just if we can just legislate our our duty away, we have still fulfilled our duty as Christians and as as God's image bearers, inherently, but then also bearing the image of Christ, in whom we experience, that initial phase of resurrection. And Paul says there, in particularly, there in Ephesians 2, that we are raised with Christ and seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. The the spiritual power that Christians have access to begin blessing as God blesses, which, God makes his rain to fall on the just and unjust, and he causes the sun to rise on the good and the righteous and the wicked. Um, that's a paraphrase.
Yeah.
But, you know, that as we've been called to do those kinds of things, the longer this conversation goes, the more I feel like I'm starting to sound like RFK.
Right.
But the
Me too. Has a little
more
bit of that.
the more we do, like the more we see that is our call, and the more that we learn that we are empowered to do those kinds of things. I think it's fair to say that it would be a dereliction of duty to hand that capacity over, to hand that um, to hand that task, if you want to call it that, to hand that over to someone else who is not the church, who is not, you know, empowered by the Spirit, who is not, raised with Christ and seated with Christ in
Yeah.
the heavenly realms. That the implications of that begin to, I think, look pretty scary and look pretty sinister if that's what we're if that's what we're doing. If we're actually saying, well, we can just, like, why wouldn't you want USA to be able to do this, or why wouldn't you want this program to cover that? It's like, because we're called to do that.
Yeah.
And there might be some discussion about when or if it's possible to partner with, local and state, agencies and things like that. Like, to have that conversation, I would
Hmm.
say have that
Yeah.
conversation. But that can't be the starting place. At least, could we at least get to this? And this is my plea to progressive Christians. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with this.
Yes. Thank you.
But my plea is, could we start with, letting God's Spirit empowered church do the work that God has given us and do the work that God has empowered us to do by means of His Spirit? Can we start there rather than relying on state power to do the kinds of things that you believe God has called us to do? Could we start with the church doing those rather than the government?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And this is one of the things that I find so frustrating about a lot of New Testament scholarship, especially in the works of the so-called anti-imperial scholars, people like N.T. Wright and Richard Horsley, is that they make these bold claims that, if Jesus is king, Caesar is not, and the New Testament is against all kinds of imperialist structures and everything like that. But then, like, when it comes down to the way that they apply their interpretation of the New Testament in the modern context, it always results in them wanting to give these governments that they say are so evil more power. Like, like the American federal government isn't the biggest and largest imperial government in the history of the world, but it's just like there's that disconnect there, because it's just that they don't think that there's any other way to do it than the way that our world is currently structured. Therefore, when we come to the conclusion that, we have to have all of these programs to help those that are needed, it has to be run by these government organizations. There's just a complete disconnect between that and then their kind of counter imperial reading of the New Testament. And it's very unfortunate. And I think it betrays a very distinct lack of clarity in their thought. And I think a lot of it is, again, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, people failing to realize that the division between conservatism and progressivism is one of style, not one of substance, in the sense that, it's starting from the same set of presuppositions. And I think that as Christians, we're called to challenge those presuppositions, and I totally agree. our engagement with the world should start with our identity in Christ. That should be the real
Mm.
beginning point, and then we can work out from there. And Christians can have good faith disagreements about how best to implement all of these principles
Yeah.
in the modern world, for sure. And that's what we're doing here. We're trying to push this conversation forward. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think it's like you said. If we wind up giving up our responsibility as Christians that we've been clearly mandated to have to other people that aren't Christians, then we've already lost the game.
Yeah. Alex, I think that's a great place to stop, my friend.
Perfect. Yeah. Hey, this has been a lot of fun, man. I appreciate you having me on to talk about this.
Likewise, sometime in the future, we need to have on another friend, whether one of your anarchist friends or something like that, because anarchists, just the name is scary.
It is.
But there's a couple of guys that I know you run with that might have some at least thought-provoking things for us. Now, I'll go ahead and say, like, I'm not an anarchist, but
Yeah.
but again, the notion of you taking some responsibility in this kind of thing, I think that's worth digging into. And honestly, that's what we've been pushing this whole time is like you, meaning the church, take some initiative
Yeah.
into pushing into doing what God has called you to do.
Yeah. Yep.
All
I
right.
totally agree.
Yeah. Alex, take care, man. We'll see you next time.
Hey, I appreciate it, Kevin. Thank you.
Bye bye.